The morning air tasted of salt and silence. A pale mist hung low over the cliffs, softening the shape of everything it touched. Elora Whitmore climbed the narrow hill that led to the cemetery, her gloved hands wrapped tightly around a small bouquet of white lilies. The flowers trembled in rhythm with her heartbeat, each step carrying her deeper into the memory she both dreaded and needed. The town below still slept, its rooftops glimmering faintly beneath the weak dawn light, unaware that grief walked among them once again. 2 years had passed since the crash that took Adrienne Cole from her, yet every Sunday she came, faithfully, quietly, carrying the same flowers, speaking to the same stone, keeping alive a love that had nowhere else to go. When she reached his grave, the wind shifted. The ocean's hum rose from beyond the cliff, the waves slow and steady, like the heartbeat of something eternal. She knelt, brushing away the thin veil of fallen leaves that had gathered over his name. The letters carved into the marble were still clean and sharp. Adrienne Cole, beloved fiancé, beloved memory. The words felt both too much and not enough. She arranged the lilies carefully, one taller than the rest, just the way he used to prefer when he brought flowers to her studio. The scent rose around her, sweet and cold. "You'd laugh at me for still doing this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible beneath the wind. "You always said I'd learn to let go." Her lips curved into a trembling half-smile that disappeared as quickly as it came. The silence answered her. Only the distant call of a gull filled the emptiness, a sound that reminded her of every lonely dawn since that night. She closed her eyes, and for a moment she could almost hear his voice, the soft timbre of it, calling her name through the rain. Then, behind her, gravel shifted. The sound was small but certain. She turned, startled, expecting the caretaker. Instead, she saw a man standing a few paces away, still as the headstones surrounding him. The morning light touched half his face, the other half swallowed by fog. For a heartbeat, Elora forgot to breathe. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his dark coat lifting slightly in the wind. There was something in his stance, something achingly familiar. She blinked once, twice, yet he didn't vanish. He only looked at her, his eyes calm and searching, as if he knew her name before she'd ever spoken it. Her heart stuttered painfully. Those eyes, that quiet intensity, the same scar just below the temple, faint but real. Impossible. Her lips parted, but no sound came. The lilies slipped from her hand, scattering across the wet ground. The man took a hesitant step forward, concern flickering across his expression. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. His voice was low, cautious, different from Adrienne's, yet holding the same unspoken gentleness that used to unravel her heart. Elora stared at him, her pulse roaring in her ears. "Who are you?" The question came out as a whisper, rough and afraid. He hesitated, watching her like someone standing on the edge of a memory. "A Julian," he said finally. "Julian Hale. I didn't mean to disturb you." His tone was apologetic, almost tender, but she barely heard the words. Her eyes moved over every line of his face, every shape that memory had burned into her mind 2 years ago. It was him, Adrienne, and yet it wasn't. The world around her tilted as though gravity had forgotten its duty. She took an uncertain step backward, her throat dry. "You." She couldn't finish the thought. Julian frowned slightly, confusion tightening his brow. "Have we met before?" She shook her head too quickly. No, she lied, though her heart screamed otherwise. The denial felt like betrayal, but truth was too heavy to speak. "Kimik." He nodded slowly, his gaze drifting to the headstone behind her. His eyes paused on the name, and something unreadable passed through him, a flicker of recognition, quickly gone. The silence between them deepened. He bent to pick up one of the lilies she had dropped. His fingers brushed hers as he handed it back, and the world seemed to still. That warmth, that electricity, she remembered it too well. The air tightened between them, heavy with the weight of something lost and half found. Elora drew her hand back quickly, pressing it against her chest as if to quiet her racing heart. "A thank you," she murmured, the words almost breaking. Julian offered a small, uncertain smile, a gesture of kindness to a stranger. "You looked sad," he said softly. "Well, I thought maybe you needed someone to ask if you were okay." His words were simple, yet they carried a gentleness that struck deeper than she expected. She forced herself to nod. "I'm fine." The lie trembled in her voice, thin as thread. The wind rose, carrying the scent of salt and earth around them. Somewhere far below, the sea crashed against the rocks, the sound echoing up the cliffs. Julian glanced once more at the grave, his expression clouded by a quiet thought. "Strange," he murmured. "I've never been here before, but this place feels familiar." Elora's breath caught. Maybe you've passed it once, she said quickly, her words trembling. Maybe, he agreed, though his tone was uncertain. He took a step back, as though realizing the weight of her silence. I'm sorry, he said again. I'll leave you to your peace. He turned, walking down the path that curved toward the trees. The mist swallowed him little by little until only the shape of his coat remained, a dark mark fading into the gray morning. Elara stood frozen, her thoughts scattering like petals in the wind. Then, without meaning to, she whispered his name. Adrian. The sound barely reached him, but he stopped, just for a moment. His head tilted slightly, as though the name had brushed against something buried deep inside him. Then he moved on, vanishing completely into the fog. Elara's knees gave way, and she sank beside the grave, clutching the lilies to her chest. The earth was damp, the wind colder now. The stone before her stood silent and indifferent, yet her heart refused to accept what her eyes had seen. Maybe grief was playing its cruelest trick, or maybe, just maybe, love had found a way to return. She closed her eyes, listening to the sea's endless rhythm, and whispered to the wind, "If that was you, come back." Somewhere in the distance, the church bell rang, slow, hollow, mournful. Before we begin this story, tell us, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it there? Now let's begin, because sometimes love doesn't end at the grave. It waits, quietly, patiently, until the world dares to believe in miracles again. That night, Elara couldn't sleep. The sound of the ocean carried through the open window, slow and steady, as if echoing her heartbeat. The image of him, the man at the grave, wouldn't fade. Every blink brought back the same face, the curve of his jaw, the faint scar near his temple, the eyes that had looked at her with such unsettling familiarity. The rain came softly, tapping the roof in rhythmic whispers, and she lay awake, counting the seconds between thunder and memory. She told herself she'd imagined it, that grief had sculpted his face from the mist. But deep inside, something refused to let go. Morning arrived gray and hesitant. The town's streets glistened with leftover rain as Elara walked to the flower shop on Main Street, her small haven since Adrian's death. The bell above the door chimed softly, the scent of roses and damp earth filling the air. Me, her closest friend and coworker, looked up from behind the counter. You're pale, he said, concerned. Rough night again? Elara forced a smile, shaking the water from her umbrella. Something like that. On me, she busied herself trimming stems, arranging carnations and lilies into neat rows, but her hands wouldn't stop trembling. Me leaned closer, lowering her voice. You went up there again, didn't you? Elara nodded. I always do. And Elara hesitated. The truth balanced on her tongue like a secret too heavy to release. Finally, she whispered, there was someone there. A man. Me's brow furrowed. The caretaker? No, someone else. Elara swallowed hard, her voice unsteady. He looked like Adrian. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Me blinked, her expression softening into pity. Elara, I know what you're thinking, she cut in quickly. I'm not losing my mind. She pressed her palms against the counter, grounding herself. He had the same eyes. The same voice. The same voice. Even the same way of... She stopped, realizing how insane it sounded out loud. He said his name was Julian Hale. Me frowned. I never heard of him. I hadn't either. Elara's voice trembled, fragile with disbelief. But when he spoke, it felt like something inside me remembered him before my mind did. Me touched her hand gently. A grief can play cruel tricks. You of all people should know. Elara nodded, though her heart whispered no. She didn't tell me about the moment his fingers brushed hers, the spark that had raced through her like recognition. That wasn't imagination. It had been real, painfully real. Painfully real. Later that afternoon, the rain eased. Elara decided to take the long route home along the cliffs. The wind carried the scent of seaweed and salt, and the path curved toward the old lighthouse, a place that had stood abandoned since before Adrian's death. But as she approached, her steps slowed. Smoke curled from its chimney. Mom was living there. Her heart pounded. Against all reason, she moved closer, drawn by something invisible. The door was half open, creaking softly. Inside, the air smelled of dust and rain-soaked wood. Footsteps echoed above. She climbed the narrow stairs quietly, her breath unsteady. At the top, surrounded by half-restored walls and scattered tools, stood Julian. He turned at the sound of her approach, surprise flickering in his expression. You, he said softly, as though he'd expected her. I was hoping you'd come. Her pulse stumbled. You remembered me? He nodded, wiping dust from his hands. You left so suddenly yesterday, I didn't even get your name. Elara, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Elara, he repeated it slowly, as if tasting something he'd known long ago. I've heard that name before. Her breath caught. Where? He looked down, brow furrowed. I don't know, maybe in a dream. The room felt smaller suddenly, the air thick with something unspoken. He gestured toward the half-covered window, where sunlight spilled across the sea. I'm restoring this place, he explained quietly. It was falling apart when I found it. Somehow it felt right to fix it. Elora moved closer, her eyes scanning the room. A notebook sat open on a table, its pages filled with sketches of the lighthouse, detailed, precise. At the corner of one page, faint initials were scrawled. AC. Her chest tightened. Her, did you get this? I was here when I arrived, he said simply. I thought maybe it belonged to the old keeper. Do you know him? She shook her head too quickly. No, she lied again. Her mind raced. Those were Adrian's initials? He had once told her he wanted to rebuild the lighthouse someday to bring light back to what was forgotten. And now this man, this stranger with Adrian's face, was doing exactly that. Julian stepped closer, curiosity softening his expression. You're shaking, he murmured. Are you afraid of me? Her lips parted. No, she whispered. I'm afraid of what you make me remember. He looked at her for a long moment, something gentle flickering behind his eyes. I don't know who I was before the accident, he said quietly. 2 years ago. I woke up in a hospital with no memory. Just a name someone told me was mine. Julian Hale. Everything else was gone. But lately, I've been dreaming about a woman. Her face, her voice. He met her gaze, his voice trembling. We think it's you. The world tilted. The sea crashed below, and the air between them trembled with something ancient and familiar. She wanted to run, to scream, to hold him. Instead, she whispered, You can't be him. He searched her face. But then why do I feel like I've found something I was never meant to lose? Elora's eyes filled with tears. Because maybe you did. They stood in silence, the sound of the waves wrapping around them like a secret. Somewhere, a clock ticked faintly, marking the seconds between disbelief and destiny. As the sun dipped behind the horizon, casting the lighthouse in gold, Elora took one step toward him, just one, and said the words that would change everything. If love can survive death, she whispered, then maybe it can survive forgetting too. Julian's breath caught. He looked at her as though he'd known her in every lifetime. And outside, the first star appeared over the sea, shining softly through the fog, as if remembering them too. The following days unfolded in a fragile haze, each moment balanced between disbelief and quiet hope. Elora found herself walking the coastal path more often, pretending it was the flowers that led her there, not the pull of something she couldn't explain. The sea had a different voice near the lighthouse, soft and endless, whispering secrets into the wind. Each visit began with hesitation, but always ended the same way, with her standing at the base of the weathered tower, staring up at the faint glow of light in its upper window, where Julian worked. He greeted her gently every time, as though afraid to break whatever invisible thread connected them. He spoke with calmness that steadied her trembling heart, yet beneath that calm, she sensed the same confusion she felt, an ache for something they couldn't name. Sometimes he would ask her questions about the town or the sea. Other times, they would simply sit in silence, the distance between them filled by the rhythmic crash of the waves. One afternoon, the sky was heavy with the scent of rain. Elora stood at the edge of the cliff while Julian hammered a beam into place above the lighthouse door. He worked with quiet precision, sleeves rolled up, the wind teasing strands of hair across his forehead. She watched him, every movement echoing memories that didn't belong to this moment but to another lifetime. The way Adrian once built the small wooden arch in her garden, the way he smiled when he thought she wasn't looking. Julian caught her gaze and smiled faintly. You come here a lot, he said, lowering his tools. I like the view, she replied softly. And the quiet. He stepped closer, studying her. You're not afraid of the storm? She shook her head. I used to be. But after a while, you stop fearing what's already taken something from you. The words slipped out before she could stop them. He didn't ask what she meant, though. His eyes deepened with a kind of understanding she couldn't bear. For a long moment, they stood in silence, clouds above rolling dark and low. When the rain began, they moved inside. The interior smelled of salt and wood oil. Lantern light flickered across the stone walls, revealing sketches, old ropes, half-finished models of ships, traces of a life rebuilding itself from fragments. Elora ran her fingers along the table's edge. pausing at the open notebook she'd seen before. The initials were still there. AC, do you ever feel like you're living someone else's life? She asked quietly. Julian turned toward her, his brow furrowed. Every day. Sometimes I wake up and wonder if I've stolen someone's place in the world. Her heart ached. Maybe it's not stolen. Maybe it's returned. He looked at her curiously, as though her words brushed something just beyond reach. You talk like you believe in fate. I didn't, she whispered. Not until you. He smiled softly, a sad kind of smile that made her chest tighten. A fate or not, I'm glad you keep coming back. The rain thickened, running in silver streams down the windows. Elora wandered toward the narrow staircase that spiraled up to the lantern room. And may I? She asked. He nodded. Anne nodded. Careful, it's steep. She climbed slowly, her fingers grazing the cold iron rail. At the top, the world opened before her in a panorama of sea and storm. The light from the beacon pulsed faintly, not yet restored to full strength. Full strength. She imagined it burning bright again one day, guiding lost sailors home through fog and darkness. She thought of Adrian then. How he used to speak of rebuilding this very place, how he believed that light always found its way back through ruin. Julian joined her a moment later, his footsteps soft on the metal stairs. It's beautiful up here, he said, looking out at the restless sea. Sometimes I think I've stood here before. Elora turned to him, her voice trembling. And maybe you have? He studied her face, the question forming but unspoken. His eyes held a distant flicker, as if a memory were trying to surface. The night before the accident, he murmured, more to himself than to her. I dreamt of water. There was a voice calling me through it. I think it was yours. She froze. She froze. Julian, what accident? He pressed a hand to his temple, his voice strained. They told me I was in a car crash 2 years ago. I woke up in a hospital a few towns away, no name, no past. A nurse said someone had written my name on a piece of paper in my coat. Julian Hale. But sometimes I wonder if that name even belongs to me. Elora's heart thundered in her chest. 2 years, the same night Adrian died. The world felt suddenly weightless beneath her. What else do you remember? She asked, her voice shaking. He looked out at the rain, his expression haunted. "A ring," he said quietly. "On my hand, and someone crying. The sound of it still follows me when I sleep." Tears blurred her vision. Her voice was barely a whisper. And maybe that someone was me. Julian turned sharply, confusion and sorrow crossing his face. Why do I feel like I've hurt you somehow? She shook her head, stepping closer. You didn't, she said, though her voice betrayed the lie. You just left. He studied her, his breath catching. For a moment, neither spoke. The wind howled outside, bending the seagrass flat against the cliffside. Elara, he said finally, her name a quiet promise on his lips. If I've known you before, if I've forgotten something important, will you help me remember? She nodded, tears falling freely now. I've been waiting for you to ask that. The storm raged harder, lightning flashing beyond the windows, illuminating their faces in brilliant white. The beacon above them flickered once, weak but alive, as if answering some silent vow. For the first time in 2 years, Elara didn't feel like she was speaking to a ghost. She was standing beside him. The storm lingered well into the night, its voice rolling endlessly across the sea. The lighthouse stood like a living thing, breathing light and shadow across the coast. Inside, Elara sat beside the small iron stove, her fingers curled around a cup of tea that had long gone cold. Julian moved quietly near the window, watching the rain trace patterns across the glass. Neither spoke for a while. The silence wasn't empty. It pulsed with the strange electricity of two people standing at the edge of something that felt fated and forbidden all at once. When he finally turned toward her, his expression was unreadable. You said you'd help me remember, he said softly. Hmm? Elara nodded, though fear coiled tight in her chest. But sometimes memory doesn't return easily, she murmured. It hides until something calls it back. He tilted his head, curious. And like what? Places, she said, avoid things that once mattered. She hesitated, then added, sometimes, love. His gaze lingered on her, and for a fleeting second, she thought she saw recognition flicker there. Then it was gone, replaced by quiet longing. I keep dreaming of the same moment, he admitted. I'm standing near water. He admitted, I'm standing near water. I hear someone crying, but I can't reach them. Then there's light, bright, blinding, and I wake up. Elara's throat tightened. It sounds like the crash, she whispered. He frowned. A crash. Her pulse stumbled. You said you had an accident 2 years ago. Do you remember anything before that? Julian ran a hand through his hair, frustration seeping into his voice. A flashes. Never whole. I see pieces that don't fit together. A ring. A woman's hand. A promise. His voice faltered. And the name Adrian. It feels familiar, but I don't know why. Elara's breath caught. The sound of that name spoken aloud after so long filled the room with invisible weight. She wanted to tell him everything. That he was Adrian Cole. That he had once loved her so fiercely, it had remade her entire world. But something inside her hesitated. If she told him too soon, would it destroy the fragile bridge between memory and reality he was slowly building? Julian's eyes searched hers. You know something, don't you? I know someone who used to live here, she said carefully. He talked about fixing this lighthouse, about making it shine again. Julian turned to look at the beacon above, its dim light pulsing faintly through the rain. And maybe that's why I came here, he murmured. Maybe this place was waiting for me. The word struck something deep in her heart. She rose and walked to the old chest by the wall, one she remembered from long ago. When she lifted the lid, a faint smell of cedar and salt drifted out. Inside lay a bundle of letters tied with a blue ribbon, letters Adrian had written to her during the months they'd been apart before his death. She'd hidden them here, unable to burn them, unable to read them again. Julian watched her, puzzled. What are those? Something I thought I'd buried, she said quietly. She untied the ribbon with shaking hands and pulled one from the stack. The paper had yellowed slightly, the ink faded but still legible. He used to write me even when we lived in the same town. Said it made words last longer that way. Julian reached out hesitantly. May I? She handed him the letter, her breath trembling. He unfolded it carefully, his eyes moving slowly across the page. The first few lines were written in Adrian's neat handwriting, gentle, thoughtful, almost too familiar. As Julian read, his expression changed. His eyes widened slightly, then darkened as though something inside him had cracked open. You go, Lamb, he said softly. This handwriting, I know it. She stared at him, her heart pounding. You do, he nodded, his voice breaking. You don't know how, but my hand remembers it. The way the letters curve, the way the ink presses too hard near the end of each line. I've written like this before. Tears filled her eyes. Julian, he pressed a hand to his forehead, closing his eyes. There's more, he whispered. A smell, oil paint. Seer. And your voice, it's like every time you speak it unlocks another door I didn't know existed. She reached for him before she could stop herself. Her fingers brushed his arm and he shivered, the air between them alive with an ache neither could name. Don't force it, she said softly. It'll come when it's ready. He looked at her, his expression raw. Why do I feel like I've already lost you once? The question stole her breath. Because you did, she whispered. Lightning flashed beyond the window, briefly illuminating the room in white fire. For a heartbeat, his reflection in the glass overlapped with the memory she'd carried for years, Adrian smiling beneath the same stormlight, promising her that nothing could ever separate them. The lower right corner bore Adrian's original initials, AC, but beside them, faintly etched, were two more letters recently carved into the wood. J.H. Julian Hale. The air in the attic seemed to thin. The connection she had tried so hard to deny pulsed vividly before her eyes. He hadn't just found fragments of Adrian's memory. He was living them, unconsciously continuing what Adrian had begun. The brushstrokes felt like whispers from across time, guiding him back to what he once loved. The floor creaked behind her, and she turned sharply, her heart leaping. Julian stood in the doorway. His hair was damp from the sea breeze, his coat dusted with salt. He looked at her, startled but calm. I knocked, he said softly. You didn't hear. She stepped back from the painting, her hand still trembling. What are you doing here? I came to return this. He lifted a small silver ring from his pocket, the metal catching the light. Her breath caught. It was his ring. Adrian's? The one she had placed on his finger before the coffin was lowered into the earth. I found it in the sand near the cliffs, Julian said quietly. I thought it might be yours. Elora's voice broke. It's not mine, she whispered. It was his. He frowned, confusion clouding his face. His? She nodded, tears spilling freely now. The man I lost. The man who looks exactly like you. Julian looked down at the ring, his fingers trembling slightly. Elora, I don't know how to explain this, but when I touched it, I felt searching for the right words. Lily saw flashes, a woman crying. This house. That painting. His gaze lifted to the canvas behind her, and he froze. For a moment, he couldn't move. "That's you," he said softly. "I've seen this before. In my dreams." She swallowed hard. "Adrian painted it, before he died." Julian took a step forward, his eyes never leaving the portrait. "It's not finished." No," she whispered. "But someone added to it." He blinked, confused. "I didn't." Then he stopped. His brow furrowed, a look of dawning fear passing across his face. "Oh wait, last week. I woke one night and found paint on my hands. I thought it was from repairing the shutters. But I came here, didn't I?" Elora nodded, her voice breaking. "You..." He stared at the painting, his initials carved into the corner beside Adrian's. "Why would I do that?" "Because you remember," she said softly. "Even if you don't realize it." Julian's eyes met hers, and something inside him seemed to fracture. Fear, confusion, recognition all colliding at once. "Elora, who am I to you?" Her voice was a whisper. "You are my fiancé?" The words filled the attic like the toll of a bell. Julian took a step back, his breath catching. "No," he said faintly, though his eyes betrayed the truth already forming there. "That's not possible." She reached for him, her voice trembling. "You were Adrian Cole. You died in that crash. But somehow you're here." Julian pressed a hand to his temple, his face pale. "Stop," he breathed. "You can't..." Tears streamed down her cheeks. "You said you wanted to remember," she whispered. "And now you are." He stumbled back toward the stairway, shaking his head. "I don't know what's real anymore." As he turned to leave, Elora's voice followed him, soft but certain. "A love is," she said. "That's all that's ever been real." He paused at the doorway, his hand gripping the frame as though holding himself together. Then he looked back once, his eyes wet and filled with something ancient and familiar. "If that's true," he said hoarsely, "then maybe love's been haunting me this whole time." The wind stirred through the attic, lifting the white cloth from the floor. It fluttered across the painting like a ghost's final breath. And as Julian disappeared down the stairs, Elora turned back to the portrait, the two sets of initials gleaming faintly in the light. Two names carved into one unfinished story. The days that followed passed in uneasy quiet. The revelation in the attic had changed everything between them, though neither dared to speak of it again. Julian avoided Elora's house now, but sometimes she saw him from her window, standing on the cliffs near the lighthouse, staring at the sea like a man trying to read a language he'd once known by heart. The town went on as it always did, preparing for the Lantern Festival, a yearly tradition meant to honor the souls of those who had been lost to the sea. Elora had never missed a year, though she'd stopped lighting her own lantern after Adrian's death. This time, she wasn't sure what she was mourning anymore, what she'd lost, or what had somehow returned. That evening, the town square glowed in warm gold. Strings of lights hung between the buildings, flickering softly against the darkening sky. Children ran with paper lanterns in their hands, their laughter carried by the wind. Elora walked through the crowd like someone wandering through a dream, her heart beating in slow, uncertain rhythms. She carried a single lantern, its paper pale white, its flame not yet lit. Yugo. The scent of salt and cinnamon filled the air, mingling with the faint sound of violin music from a nearby stall. Every corner of the festival was alive. Faces she'd known all her life, hands passing candles, voices calling out. But all she could think about was whether Julian would come. She told herself he wouldn't. Yet when she turned toward the edge of the pier, there he was, standing apart from everyone else, the wind teasing at his coat, his eyes lost to the horizon. For a long time, she didn't move. She simply watched him, feeling the pull of something she could no longer resist. Then, as though sensing her gaze, Julian turned. Their eyes met across the lantern-lit crowd, and the world seemed to fall away until only they remained. He didn't smile, but there was something in his expression, a quiet plea, a recognition that neither of them could explain. She walked toward him slowly. When she reached him, he spoke first. "I wasn't going to come," he said softly, his voice barely audible over the wind. "Then why did you?" she asked. He hesitated, his gaze drifting over the sea. "Because I dreamed of it," he said. "Of you standing here, holding a lantern. I thought it was just my imagination, but when I woke up, I couldn't stay away." Elora's breath caught. "You've been remembering again." "Not clearly," he murmured. "Just flashes. The smell of paint, the sound of rain. Your voice." He turned to her then, his eyes deep with confusion and longing. "Every time I see you, the world feels both familiar and wrong. Like I'm walking through someone else's life, but can't find the exit." She swallowed hard. And maybe it's not someone else's life. she said quietly. And maybe it's yours. He shook his head, pain flickering across his face. I don't know who I am anymore, Alara. Julian. Adrian. Both. Neither. I can't tell where the past ends and the present begins. She reached into her coat and pulled out a match, striking it gently against the stone railing. The flame flared, small but alive. Then maybe stop trying to divide them, she whispered. I'll light this with me. He looked down at her lantern, hesitant. What does it mean? It means remembrance, she said. It means letting go. He stared at the flickering flame, then at her. Slowly, he took the match from her hand, their fingers brushing for just an instant. Together, they held it to the lantern's wick until the paper began to glow from within, warm and golden. The light cast soft shadows across their faces, erasing the distance between who they were and who they had become. As they stood side by side, the others around them began releasing their lanterns into the wind. One by one, hundreds of lights lifted into the sky, rising like stars reborn. The sea mirrored them, scattering their reflections across its dark surface. For the first time in years, Elora felt a sense of peace, fragile but real. Julian watched the lanterns drift upward, his expression softening. It's beautiful, he said quietly. I like the skies remembering everyone it's taken. She nodded, tears glimmering in her eyes. It's supposed to bring comfort. Does it? She hesitated. It used to. He turned toward her then, his gaze tender but questioning. And now? And now, she whispered, it just hurts differently. A faint smile touched his lips, sad and understanding. I wish I could promise it won't always hurt. You already did, she said softly, meeting his eyes. Once? He froze, something flickering behind his expression, a memory just beyond reach. When? Oh, before the accident, she said. In another life. The words hung between them like the lantern's light, delicate and trembling. Julian looked away, his jaw tight. If I was him, he murmured, then why do I feel like I'm both lost and found at the same time? Because love doesn't return as it left, she said. It comes back changed. He looked at her then, truly looked, as though trying to memorize her face. I'm afraid of what I'll find if I remember everything. Then remember it slowly, she said. I'll be here. The wind shifted, catching her hair and the hem of her coat. Their lantern began to lift, tugged gently upward. Julian reached out, steadying it for a moment, his fingers brushing hers once more. Then he let go. Together, they watched as it floated into the night, rising higher until it was just another light among hundreds. For a long while, the silence between them wasn't empty this time. It was full, alive, like a held breath. Finally, Julie whispered, when I see you, I feel like I've been given another chance. Elora turned toward him, her voice barely a breath. Maybe you have. Maybe you. The last of the lanterns vanished into the clouds, their glow fading into the stars. Around them, laughter and music began to quiet as the crowd drifted away. But Elora and Julian remained at the edge of the pier, their reflections trembling in the dark water below. When he finally spoke again, his voice was low, almost fearful. Elora, if I was him, if I really was Adrian, would you still love me now, even if I'm not the same? She met his gaze, her answer steady despite the ache in her chest. A love doesn't ask who you've become, it just finds you again. A long silence followed, broken only by the distant hum of the tide. Then Julian reached up and brushed a raindrop, or maybe a tear, from her cheek. And in that fleeting moment, under the soft glow of 1,000 floating lanterns, he whispered, almost to himself, I think I've loved you before. The night of the lanterns faded into memory, but its light lingered in Elora's heart like the last ember of a long-forgotten fire. Sleep eluded her. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw Julian's face illuminated by lantern glow, the way his fingers had brushed her cheek before the moment vanished into silence. By dawn, she rose from her bed and sat by the window, watching the pale horizon form above the sea. It was strange how love could feel both resurrected and fragile, as though any sudden truth might shatter it back into loss. The following afternoon, the flower shop was quiet. Rain tapped gently on the glass, and the scent of lilies filled the room. Elora arranged a bouquet for a customer, but found her hands trembling again, distracted by thoughts she could no longer escape. Me noticed. You've been somewhere else all week, she said, handing her a ribbon. Is it him again? Elora hesitated, then nodded. He was at the festival. Me sighed. You can't keep chasing ghosts, Elora. I'm not chasing, she said softly. He found me. Me frowned, pity softening her expression. Whatever you think you saw. But Elara didn't let her finish. The bell above the door chimed, and Julian stepped inside, Rain clinging to his coat. The sight of him stole the rest of her breath. His presence felt different now. Calmer, heavier somehow, like the weight of a truth beginning to form. He smiled faintly at me before turning to Elara. "I found something," he said. "Can we talk?" Me glanced between them, uncertain, then nodded toward the back. "A go," she said quietly. "Before I change my mind." They stepped outside beneath the awning where the rain softened into mist. Julian reached into his coat and pulled out a small, weathered photograph sealed in a clear sleeve. He held it out, his fingers trembling slightly. "I found it in one of the drawers at the lighthouse," he said. "I think it's you." Elara's breath hitched as she took it. The edges were frayed, the image faded, but there was no mistaking it. It was her, standing by the cliffs in a summer dress, sunlight on her hair. Beside her was a man with his arm around her waist. Adrian. His smile was faint but certain, his eyes filled with that same quiet warmth she remembered. And yet, it was Julian's face. The same eyes, the same curve of jaw, the same scar. Her throat tightened. "Where did you get this?" He shook his head. "I don't know. It was in a journal I hadn't opened before. The handwriting looked like mine, but the words—" He hesitated, then pulled the journal from his pocket. Its pages were damp, ink-smudged, but she could still make out fragments of the writing. "For her, I will find my way back. If time breaks, love will lead me through." Her knees weakened. "Julian, this is Adrian's handwriting." He stared at the page, his brow furrowed. "But I wrote this," he whispered. "I remember the movement of the pen, the pressure. Don't understand." She reached out, placing her hand over his. "Maybe you don't need to. Maybe you just have to accept that something impossible happened. And that we're standing in it." His eyes lifted to hers, a storm of emotion in them. "Do you believe that?" "Yes," she said simply. "Because the man in that photo died 2 years ago, and somehow he's standing in front of me now." Julian drew back slightly, shaking his head. "If I was him, if I really was this Adrian, why don't I remember you fully? Why do I only get pieces?" "Because memories aren't meant to survive what you did," she whispered. "But love did." He looked at her, pained. "You think love can survive death?" "I know it can," she said. "You're proof." The silence that followed was thick with unspoken truth. The rain deepened, drumming softly against the awning. He turned the photograph over in his hands, tracing the outlines of their younger selves. "I've had dreams," he said slowly. "Of this exact moment, you, me, the sea behind us. I thought it was just imagination, but now, maybe it was memory. And maybe memory is trying to come home," she whispered. He looked at her, his voice trembling. "And if it does, will you still want me? I'm not who I was. I'm a stranger wearing his face." She smiled faintly, tears gathering in her eyes. "And then I'll learn to love you again." For a moment, neither moved. The air between them vibrated with all that had been lost and found. Julian stepped closer, his breath warm in the cool air. "Every time I see you, something inside me aches," he said softly, not in pain, in recognition. "And stop fighting it," she whispered. "But let it come." He closed his eyes, his hand trembling as it reached up to touch her cheek. The instant their skin met, something shifted, a rush of warmth, a cascade of sound and light. He gasped, his body tensing as if struck by lightning. Elara grabbed his arm, frightened. "A Julian?" He opened his eyes, dazed. "I saw it," he whispered. "The crash, the fire, you calling my name. I reached for you but couldn't move." Then darkness. His voice broke. "And now I'm here." Tears blurred her vision. "Do you remember?" "At pieces," he said, his breath unsteady. "Enough to know that I shouldn't be alive." She shook her head, her voice trembling. "You are, and maybe that means something bigger than either of us." He looked at her then, truly looked as if seeing her for the first time and all over again. "I don't know how this happened," he said. "But if love brought me back, then I can't waste it." Elara smiled through her tears. "Then don't." They stood there beneath the rain, the photograph between them, its faded edges fluttering in the breeze. The world around them seemed to quiet, holding its breath. Julian pressed the picture into her hands. "Creep it," he said softly. "And if I forget again, remind me that I found my way once. In?" She nodded, clutching it to her chest. "I will." As he turned to leave, the clouds parted slightly, and a thin beam of sunlight touched the water. It gleamed across his face, catching on the scar that once marked Adrian, glowing gold for just a heartbeat. Elara watched him go, her heart caught between miracle and grief. Because she finally understood. Love had brought him back, but memory still belonged to time. Elara sat alone in her living room, the photograph resting on the table before her, its faded edges trembling each time thunder shook the windows. She couldn't take her eyes off it. Off the man who looked like Julian but wasn't, or perhaps was more than either of them could understand. Every answer she thought she had found only led to another question. But one thing was certain, the past was not done with them. When the knock came, it startled her. The wind howled, rattling the door, but underneath the storm she heard his voice, soft, strained. "Elara, it's me." She opened the door, and Julian stood there drenched, his eyes wild with something between fear and revelation. "I remember," he said breathlessly. "Not all of it, but enough." She pulled him inside, shutting the door against the storm. "Tell me, he didn't sit." He paced, his hands shaking as though the act of remembering burned through him. "The crash, it wasn't like I thought. I wasn't alone. You were there." His voice broke on the words. "We were driving back from the coast. It was raining hard. I was talking, distracted, and then there were lights. The sound of metal tearing. You screamed my name." He pressed his palms to his temples, his eyes shutting tight. And then nothing. Just light. White. Endless light. Elara's heart pounded. "I remember that night," she whispered. "They said the car caught fire before they could reach you. I was thrown clear." He turned toward her, his face pale. "They told me I died. Maybe I did. But I woke up miles away, with no name, no memory, just this." He touched the scar near his temple. "The nurse said it was a miracle I survived it all. But sometimes when I dream, I'm still in that car. I hear you calling me, but I can't reach you. It's like the crash never ended." Tears welled in her eyes. "Julian, Adrian, whatever name you wear, you came back to me. That has to mean something." He shook his head, trembling. "Or it means I never really left. Maybe part of me has been trapped there all this time, caught between dying and living, between forgetting and remembering." He looked up, his voice breaking. "And maybe that's why I found the lighthouse, why I found you, because some part of me was still trying to finish what was left undone." Elara stepped closer, her hands reaching for his. "You think you're a ghost? I don't know what I am," he said hoarsely. "More fire." "I remember holding the wheel, trying to turn, and the water rising around me. The sound. It wasn't just thunder, it was the sea. I saw your face, and then I was somewhere else. Empty. Silent. Until one day I woke up again." Her fingers tightened around his, grounding him. "You woke up because love wouldn't let you go." He looked at her, his eyes full of pain. "You make it sound beautiful. But what if it's not? What if I wasn't meant to come back?"
"Then fate made a mistake worth keeping," she said, her voice trembling but sure. "You're here now. That's what matters." Lightning flashed through the window, illuminating the photograph on the table. Julian's gaze flicked toward it, and he froze. Slowly, he reached for it, tracing the image with shaking fingers. "That day," he whispered, "before the crash. We took that picture by the cliffs. You made me promise we'd come back there for our wedding." His voice cracked. "I never kept that promise." Elara's tears slipped free. "You did now," she said softly. "You found your way back to where it began." He looked at her, sorrow and wonder mingling in his expression. "I don't understand how any of this is possible. I shouldn't be alive. You buried me." "I know," she whispered. "We watched them lower your coffin into the ground. I thought it was over, but maybe what we bury isn't always gone." Julian sank into the chair by the window, his head in his hands. "Sometimes I still feel the crash," he said quietly. "Every time it rains, I hear the tires on the road, the sound of the car spinning. It's like time folded, and I slipped through the cracks." She knelt in front of him, her voice barely a breath. "Then let me pull you out." His hands fell to his sides, and he looked at her with something raw and unguarded. "You shouldn't have to. I already did once," she whispered, "when I dragged you out of that wreck before they found us." His eyes widened. "You saved me. I screamed your name until you did. I thought that meant you'd live. But in the hospital they said you didn't make it." He swallowed hard, emotion choking his voice. "And maybe part of me didn't. Maybe part of me stayed with you because I couldn't bear to leave." Elara brushed a strand of wet hair from his forehead. "Then maybe this is the part that came back to finish the story." He looked at her, his eyes glistening with tears. "And if I disappear again," she smiled faintly through her own tears, "then I'll find you again." Thunder rolled across the cliffs, but the sound no longer frightened her. The storm outside had found its echo within them. But it no longer felt destructive. It felt cleansing, necessary. I remember everything that matters, he said softly. You, the sea, the promise, and the love? She whispered. He nodded. That too. They stayed like that, the storm raging outside while the air between them hummed with the quiet pulse of something eternal. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from understanding, but from surrender, the acceptance that love didn't obey the laws of life or death, only the gravity of the heart. As lightning illuminated the room once more, Ilara thought she saw, for just an instant, the faint shimmer of something beyond the rain, like two worlds overlapping, one ending where the other began. She didn't know which side of the crash they truly lived on anymore. She only knew that he was here, breathing, holding her hand, and that for the first time since the night he died, she wasn't afraid of the dark. The storm passed by morning, leaving behind a world washed pale and fragile. The ocean lay quiet again, its surface still trembling from the night's violence. Inside the cottage, the fire had gone out, its last embers cooling in the hearth. Ilara sat at the table with the photograph beside her, tracing its edges over and over as though trying to hold her own life in her hands. The sound of footsteps behind her made her turn. Julian stood by the doorway, his face shadowed with exhaustion. He had not slept either. For a long time neither spoke. The silence stretched, heavy and uncertain like the space between heartbeats. At last, Julian said quietly, I think I should go. The word struck her like a blade. Go where? He hesitated. Away from here. From you. From you. From this. His voice trembled as he gestured vaguely at the photograph. The room, the pieces of a life that wasn't his and yet somehow was. The more I remember, the less I understand. I feel like I'm breaking in too. Maybe if I leave, you can finally move on. Ilara rose, her voice sharp with disbelief. Move on? After everything? His eyes were full of anguish. You deserve peace, and I can't give it to you. I'm not the man you lost, Ilara. I carry his face, his voice, but not his certainty. I wake up every morning wondering if I'm still supposed to exist. She crossed the space between them, her words trembling. And you think running will fix that? I don't know what else to do. He turned away, his hands clenched. You've built your life around a ghost, and maybe that's all I am. A memory that refused to stay buried. Her heart ached at the sound of it. You're not a ghost. Then what am I? His voice cracked. Tell me, Ilara. Am I him? Or am I just someone fate stitched together to look like him? She stepped closer until she could feel his breath. You are what's left when love refuses to die, she whispered. Julian's eyes glistened, but he didn't reach for her. That's not an answer. That's a prayer. The space between them pulsed with everything they could not say. Outside, gulls cried over the cliffs, their voices fading into the wind. Ilara's throat tightened. If you walk away now, she said softly, you'll be breaking both of us all over again. He closed his eyes, pain etched across his face. Maybe we're already broken. She shook her head fiercely. No, we're unfinished. For a moment, something flickered in his eyes. A memory, a feeling, she couldn't tell which. He looked at her as though memorizing the lines of her face for the last time. I thought it was a dream, but now I think it was you. It was, she said, tears welling. Every night for months I whispered your name before I fell asleep. I told the world I'd trade anything just to hear you breathe again. Julian's jaw trembled. Maybe that's why I'm here, he whispered. But if love called me back, what if it can't hold me here? She shook her head, her voice breaking. Don't say that. He looked at her then, eyes shining with sorrow. You said once that love can survive death. But what if surviving isn't the same as living? The question hung in the air like smoke. I'm gone. Ilara had no answer. Only the sound of her own heart breaking. He took a step backward toward the door, the dim morning light outlining him like a figure caught between worlds. Julian. Please, she said, her voice trembling. If you go. Where will you go? He hesitated. The lighthouse, he murmured. It's the only place that feels mine. Maybe if I stay there, I can figure out who I'm supposed to be. She wanted to stop him, to hold him until memory returned, but she saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the quiet desperation of a man who no longer knew which life belonged to him. So instead she only whispered, Then promise me you'll come back. He looked at her for a long, unspoken moment. If I can. The door closed softly behind him, and the silence that followed was unbearable. The house felt emptier than it ever had, as if the air itself had been hollowed out. Alara sank to the floor beside the window, clutching the photograph to her chest. Outside, the sea stretched endless and cold, its colour matching the ache in her heart. Days passed without word. She visited the cliffs every evening, staring at the lighthouse in the distance, its faint light flickering through the fog. Sometimes she thought she saw his shadow move in the lantern room, and sometimes she feared it was only her longing inventing ghosts again. One night, unable to bear it, she made her way to the lighthouse. The climb was harder than she remembered, the air sharp and full of salt. The door creaked open beneath her hand. Inside, the fire was dying, and Julian was nowhere in sight. But on the table lay his journal, open to a fresh page. Her trembling fingers brushed over the ink. The words were short, written hastily but clear. If the crash never ended, maybe this is what came after, the hollow between hearts that forgot how to beat together. Alara pressed her hand to the page, tears falling onto the ink until the letters began to blur. The air felt colder than before, the silence too deep. She looked up at the staircase, half expecting to hear his footsteps, but only the sound of the wind answered. The lighthouse light flickered weakly, struggling against the dark. And for the first time since he'd returned, Alara felt truly afraid that she might lose him again, not to death this time, but to the emptiness that comes when love remembers and memory forgets. The lighthouse had grown colder since the night she found his journal. Alara stood at the threshold, her hand resting on the weathered doorframe, unsure if crossing it would bring her closer to him or to another kind of loss. The wind outside carried the scent of rain, the sky a bruise of gathering storm. Inside, the silence was unbroken except for the slow drip of water from the ceiling, falling rhythmically onto the wooden floor. Julian was gone again. She could feel it, not just in the emptiness of the room, but in the air itself, as though the very walls knew he had left. She moved to the table where the journal still lay open, the ink now faintly smudged where her tears had fallen. Beneath the last line he had written, the hollow between hearts that forgot how to beat together, there was something new, a slip of paper tucked beneath the journal cover. It was yellowed, the edges worn. She unfolded it carefully, her breath catching as she recognized the handwriting. Adrian's. Her knees weakened and she sank into the chair, the paper trembling in her hands. The letter was dated 2 days before the crash. My dearest Alara, if you are reading this, it means I didn't get the chance to tell you everything. I don't believe in accidents of the soul. I believe that some loves bend time, that they leave echoes strong enough to find their way back, even after everything else is gone. If anything ever happens to me, promise you won't stop listening for those echoes. They'll sound like my heartbeat in the dark. Her eyes blurred, her pulse racing. It was as though the letter had been waiting for her all this time, waiting to finish what he had started. Beneath the signature, she noticed another line, faint but freshly written in different ink. You found me, Alara. I think I'm remembering now. Her breath caught. The handwriting was Julian's. He must have found the letter, read it, answered it, and left it behind. For a moment she felt both comfort and dread twist together in her chest. He was remembering. Yes, but what had he remembered that drove him away again? The rain began to fall harder outside, the sound echoing through the hollow tower. She rose and lit the lantern on the table, the flame trembling to life. The room filled with a warm, fragile glow. It was then she noticed the box beside the chest, half hidden beneath a dusty tarp. She knelt, lifting the lid. Inside were bundles of letters tied with a dark blue ribbon, the same colour Adrian always used. Her hands shook as she lifted the top bundle, untying it slowly. The first letter was dated the week of his funeral, but it was addressed not to her, but from her, written in her handwriting. She frowned, confused. She had never written these. As she unfolded it, the truth became clear. It was his writing mimicking hers, as though trying to keep her voice alive after death. You're still here, aren't you? The letter read, in the wind, in the sound of the sea. I can't see you, but I feel you. If time ever bends in our favour, I'll wait at the lighthouse. Tears blurred her vision. You were waiting, she whispered to the empty air. And you came back. She pulled out another letter, one dated a year later. I can't rest until I see you again. I dream of the lighthouse every night. Maybe I left too much of myself behind. The final letter in the bundle was different. Its paper cleaner, the ink newer. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it. Alara, it read in Julian's unmistakable handwriting. I found these letters tonight. I don't know who I was when I wrote them, but I know who I am when I read them. someone who loves you still. Maybe death isn't the end, but a kind of distance, and somehow I walked the length of it to find you again. I'm going back to the place where it happened. I need to see it one last time. If I don't return, know that I never stopped coming back to you." Her pulse thundered in her ears. "But the place where it happened," she whispered. "The cliffs, the road where the crash had taken him." She grabbed her coat and the lantern, running out into the storm. The rain soaked her within seconds, the wind clawing at her hair, but she didn't stop. The path was steep and slick, her boots sliding over mud and stone. Lightning flashed in the distance, illuminating the jagged edge of the cliffs where the road curved dangerously close to the sea. Through the sheets of rain, she saw him, Julian, standing near the edge, his coat whipping in the wind. The lantern light flickered across his face, and for an instant he looked exactly as he had that night years ago. "Julian!" she shouted, her voice breaking against the wind. He turned slowly, his eyes distant, unfocused, as though he were somewhere between two worlds. "Ilara," he said softly, his voice barely audible. "It's all coming back." She moved closer, careful not to startle him. "Then come back to me, right now, please." He shook his head, his gaze drifting toward the dark water below. "You remember the crash, the light, the sound of your voice. I thought it ended there. But what if it didn't? What if I've been living the space between?" "You're not between," she cried. "You're here, with me." He looked at her, tears mixing with the rain. "Then why does it feel like I'm fading?" Her heart seized. "Because you keep looking backward. Look at me instead." Lightning tore through the sky, illuminating his face in sharp relief. He stepped back from the edge, his hand trembling as he reached toward her. "I found your letters," he said. "They called to me. I think that's how I came back." "Oh, then don't leave," she whispered. "If love called you here, it can keep you here." For a moment he hesitated, the wind howling around them. Then his fingers brushed hers, cold and unsteady, and something shifted. The rain softened, the air stilled. His eyes cleared, filling with warmth, recognition, and fear. "Ilara," he breathed, "I never meant to leave you there on that road." "You didn't," she said, her voice breaking. "You found your way home." Thunder rolled far away, fading toward the sea. He looked down at their joined hands, the faint glow of the lantern reflecting in his eyes. "Maybe this time," he said softly. "I can stay." But even as he spoke, the wind rose again, fierce and sudden, tugging at the edges of his coat. For a heartbeat, she thought the storm would take him, that the space between life and death would reclaim what love had stolen back. She held tighter, her voice trembling. "Don't go." He met her gaze, his expression filled with aching tenderness. "I'll never stop finding you," he whispered, and as the storm began to calm, the lantern flame flickered once, then steadied, its light glowing strong against the darkness. The storm retreated to a distant growl, leaving the air heavy with the scent of salt and smoke. Ilara stood trembling on the cliffs, her soaked dress clinging to her skin, the lantern dimming in her grasp. Julian's hand was still in hers, cold but steady, as if the world itself had paused to listen. For a moment, neither spoke. Then, quietly, he said, "I need to go back to the lighthouse." Her breath caught. "Not tonight. It's too dangerous. I have to," he said, his voice low but certain. "That's where it began. The light, the memory, the letters, everything leads back there." Ilara hesitated, glancing toward the horizon. "At Yorse." The lighthouse stood far in the distance, its faint beam cutting through the mist. It looked fragile, lonely, alive in a way that frightened her. "Then I'm coming with you," she said. They walked in silence along the wet path, the world around them eerily still except for the distant crash of waves. Each step felt like walking deeper into memory, into something sacred and inevitable. When they reached the lighthouse, Julian paused, looking up at it. "It feels like it's waiting," he murmured. Ilara swallowed hard. "And maybe it is." Inside, the air was thick and damp. Lanterns Julian had left burning earlier flickered weakly, casting long shadows against the curved walls. The smell of oil filled the air, too much of it. Ilara realized with unease. Julian didn't seem to notice. He was already climbing the narrow staircase, his hand trailing along the cold iron railing. She followed him, heart pounding, the flame in her lantern wavering with each step. When they reached the lantern room, Julian stood before the great glass window, staring out at the sea. "I remember this view," he said quietly. "I stood here before. Just before I proposed to you. I thought if we ever lost our way, this would guide us back." Ilara's throat tightened. It did. He turned to her in despair. And yet, I keep asking myself, what if I was never meant to come back? What if this light was supposed to stay off? I don't say that, she whispered. You didn't come back by mistake. You came because love remembered you. He smiled faintly, a shadow of the man she once knew. A love remembered. But did time forgive? Before she could answer, a sharp crack split the silence. The lantern flame flared suddenly, unnaturally bright. Ilara turned toward it just as a spark leapt from the oil-soaked wick to the wooden beam beside it. Within seconds, fire caught, the smell of burning oil filling the room. "Julian," she cried. "It's the oil downstairs. It's catching." He spun around, eyes wide. "Get out. And no, I'm not leaving without you." He grabbed her arm, trying to pull her toward the stairs, but the flames spread faster than either of them expected. The wind howled through the broken glass, feeding the fire. The heat was unbearable, the air choking. The light that had once guided sailors home now burned with a fury that threatened to consume them both. Julian ripped his coat from his shoulders, beating at the flames near the railing. "Go!" he shouted, coughing. "I'll stop it! You can't!" Ilara's voice broke. "You'll die!" He turned toward her, his eyes fierce through the smoke. "I already did once." The words tore through her like a blade. She lunged toward him, trying to help, but the floor trembled under the weight of the fire. Sparks rained from above, stinging her arms. Julian reached for her, his hand closing around hers just as a section of the roof gave way, sending a rush of fire between them. "Ilara!" he shouted, his voice lost to the roar. She stumbled back, her body colliding with the stairwell wall. For a terrible moment she couldn't see him through the smoke. The fire was alive, devouring everything. She screamed his name again, desperate. "Julian!" Then through the haze she saw him. He was near the window, his body outlined by flame and light, struggling to reach the main lamp. He turned the handle, forcing it open, letting the storm's wind pour in. Rain lashed through the opening, the downpour hitting the fire like a furious salvation. Steam rose in great clouds, hissing and twisting around them. "Ilara," he called hoarsely, "we can still save it." She pushed forward through the smoke, coughing, her lungs burning. Together they pulled down the heavy curtain, smothering what flames they could. The air was suffocating, the heat unbearable, but slowly, painfully, the fire began to die. When the last flame flickered out, Ilara collapsed to her knees, gasping for air. Julian was beside her, his face streaked with soot, his hands blistered. For a moment, silence returned, the same silence that had followed every storm they'd ever survived. He turned to her, his voice weak but steady. "You should have left, and let you burn alone," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Never." He smiled faintly, the faintest trace of the man she had once known shining through the ash and exhaustion. "You always were stubborn." "Alive," she corrected. "We're alive." But as she reached for him, she saw the cut along his arm, deep and dark, and the blood soaking through his sleeve. Julian," she breathed. "You're hurt." He glanced down, unconcerned. "It's nothing. It's not nothing," she said, tears welling. "You saved me again." He looked at her for a long moment, his expression soft, almost peaceful. "And maybe that's what I was brought back for," he whispered. "To make sure you survived the fire this time." Her tears spilled freely now. "Don't say that." He smiled, his hand finding hers. "You once said love could bring me back from death. Maybe this is how it ends. Love returning me to where I came from." She shook her head violently, gripping his hand tighter. "No, you're staying with me. You hear me? You're staying." Outside, lightning flashed again, flooding the room with light. For a moment, she thought she saw two shadows reflected on the wall, one of them flickering, fading at the edges like smoke caught in wind. "Julian," she whispered, "don't leave me again." He pressed his forehead against hers, his breath warm despite the cold rain that poured through the window. "I'll find you," he said softly. "And no matter how long it takes." The light from the extinguished fire glowed faintly around them, golden and gentle now, like the last heartbeat of a miracle. Ilara closed her eyes, holding onto him as tightly as she could, refusing to feel the space that was already beginning to grow between them. Morning arrived in fragments of muted light and hushed voices. Ilara woke to the sterile scent of antiseptic and the rhythmic hum of machines. Her body felt heavy, her throat raw from smoke. For a few seconds, she didn't know where she was. Then the memory hit, the fire, the storm, the light, and Julian's hand slipping from hers. Panic seized her chest. She bolted upright, the world spinning around her. "Julian," she gasped. "Where is he?" A nurse appeared at her side, gentle but firm. You're safe, Miss Whitmore. You inhaled a lot of smoke, but you'll recover. Elora shook her head. And the man who was with me, the man from the lighthouse, please tell me he's here. The nurse hesitated. He's alive, she said finally. Barely, but he's alive. Relief flooded her so fast it left her trembling. I need to see him. A doctor's orders, the nurse warned softly. Only a few minutes. They led her through a quiet hallway, its white walls echoing with the faint beeps of machines. When she entered his room, she froze. Julian lay still against the sheets, his skin pale beneath the harsh hospital light. Bandages covered his arms, a kneesy line traced into his wrist. The sight of him, alive but so fragile, was both unbearable and miraculous. She moved to his side, her hands trembling as she brushed a strand of hair from his forehead. You kept your promise, she whispered. You found me. He stirred faintly at her voice, his eyelids fluttering. When his gaze finally met hers, it was clouded with exhaustion, but alive. Elara, he murmured, his voice rough as if spoken from another world. I'm here, she said quickly. You're safe now. He smiled faintly, a shadow of warmth flickering in his eyes. Did we stop the fire? She nodded, tears filling her eyes. We did. The lighthouse is still standing. Oh, good, he whispered, his voice fading. It deserved another chance. Elara's hand tightened around his. So do you. For a while there was silence, broken only by the steady beep of the heart monitor beside them. She watched the rhythm, each beat a fragile miracle. You scared me, she whispered. He looked at her weakly. I think I scared myself. When I woke up in the ambulance, I thought maybe it was all over again, that I hadn't made it this time. But you did, she said firmly. You're here. You came back again. He let out a soft, broken laugh. It may be love doesn't know how to quit. Tears slipped down her cheeks. It doesn't. His eyes drifted to the window beside them. Beyond the glass, the sky was grey and full of rain, the sea faintly visible in the distance. I used to dream of this view, he murmured. I think it's where everything started to return. Elara followed his gaze. Do you remember everything now? He hesitated, his brow furrowing. Not everything. Some pieces still feel like they belong to someone else. I remember the crash, the fire, the way it felt to lose you. But there's something between those moments I can't reach, a silence I lived in. He turned back to her, his voice soft. Maybe I wasn't supposed to bring that part back. She shook her head. You brought enough. You came back to me. That's all that matters. He studied her face as though memorizing every detail. And if I forget again? She smiled faintly through her tears. Then I'll remind you. Every day, if I have to. He reached for her hand, his grip weak but certain. You've always been stronger than me. That's not true, she whispered. You've just had to find your strength twice. He closed his eyes briefly, a faint smile still touching his lips. When I was trapped in the car, everything was fire and noise. But there was one thing that stayed, your voice. It kept calling me back. That's what I followed, even when I didn't know who I was. Her heart broke and healed in the same instant. Then never stopped listening to it. He opened his eyes again, the faint glow of life returning to them. I won't. Not anymore. The nurse entered quietly to check the machines, giving Elara a kind smile. He needs rest. You should too. Elara nodded but didn't move. Just one more minute, the nurse hesitated, then left them alone again. Elara sat there in the stillness, listening to the faint rhythm of his breathing, the heartbeat of someone who had defied both time and death to return. She brushed her thumb against his hand, tracing the lines of his palm as if reading the story fate had rewritten. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. You once said love bends time, she murmured, and maybe it broke it instead, and we just learned how to live inside the cracks. Julian smiled faintly, his eyes half closed. Then maybe the cracks are where love hides. The room grew quiet again. Rain streaked down the window, each drop glimmering like glass tears. Elara turned toward it, watching the sea blur in the distance. She thought of the lighthouse standing against the storm, its light weak but unwavering, like a heart that refused to stop beating, no matter how many times it broke. Julian stirred again, his voice faint but full of meaning. Elara, if this is another chance, I want to do it right. All of it. No running, no forgetting. Her tears fell freely now. And then start with this moment, she whispered. Start with me. He smiled, eyes closing. Always with you. She leaned forward, pressing her forehead gently against his, feeling the slow, steady rhythm of his breath. Outside, the clouds began to thin. and a pale beam of sunlight slipped through, touching the window with quiet grace. It illuminated their hands, hers clutching his, as though sealing a vow that even time could no longer undo. And for the first time since the crash, the world felt still, whole, alive. The hospital quieted as night fell, its corridors echoing with the low hum of fluorescent lights. Ilara sat by Julian's bedside, the rhythmic beeping of the monitor marking each fragile second that passed. He slept deeply now, his hand warm in hers. Outside the window, the sea glimmered faintly beneath the rising moon, silver light trembling across its surface. For the first time in years, the world seemed to exhale. Yet peace came with a strange ache, a silence too vast to hold without trembling. She watched him breathe, her thoughts drifting backward through time. How many nights had she sat like this before? Waiting, hoping, speaking to the memory of a man who could no longer answer. As she'd whispered to his grave written words she never dared send and watched the seasons turn without him. Now he was here, and still she feared closing her eyes in case he disappeared again. Her fingers brushed against the pocket of her coat, feeling the faint rustle of paper inside. The letter, the one she had written a year after his death and tucked away, too painful to burn, too sacred to share. She had carried it ever since, like a heartbeat folded in ink. Slowly she pulled it out, the paper soft and worn from years of being touched but never opened. For a long time she only stared at it. Then, quietly, she unfolded the creased page. The handwriting was smaller than she remembered, the words almost trembling off the lines. "My dearest Adrian, they tell me time heals, but I don't believe it. Time only learns to hide what still hurts. I wake up every day and forget for a second that you're gone. Then I remember, and the air leaves my lungs. I still talk to you sometimes. I tell you about the sea, the storms, the flowers I leave at your grave. I imagine you answer, though I can never quite hear what you say." Her throat tightened as she read, her tears falling silently onto the page. "I wish I had told you more often how much you saved me, how much you changed the way I saw the world. You once said that love is a kind of light. I think you were right, because even after you left, everything still glows with the memory of you. If love is light, then grief must be its shadow. And I am still walking through it." Ilara's voice faltered. She looked at Julian, his face peaceful in the dim light, and continued softly, reading aloud the words her heart had once sealed away. "If there is a way to find me again, I hope you will. I hope some part of you refuses to rest until you do. And if love can cross whatever distance lies between life and whatever comes after, then I'll be waiting by the lighthouse. The one we dreamed of rebuilding. That's where I'll be." Her voice broke completely, the final words dissolving into a whisper. She pressed the letter to her chest, her tears falling freely now. Julian stirred slightly, his brow creasing as if he were hearing her from somewhere deep within. His fingers tightened weakly around hers. "You're crying," he murmured, barely awake. She wiped her eyes quickly. "It's nothing," she whispered, smiling through her tears. He opened his eyes, unfocused but gentle. "It's never nothing with you," he said softly. Her heart ached at the sound of his voice. "I was reading something I wrote for you," she confessed. "A letter I never sent." He blinked slowly, his voice faint. "Then read it to me." "I already did," she said. "You were just asleep." He smiled faintly, his gaze turning toward the window, or maybe not entirely. Ilara laughed quietly, the sound trembling. "You always had to have the last word." He turned back to her, his eyes soft but alert now, their colour steady in the dim light. "If I could have answered that letter," he whispered, "I would have told you I heard every word of it." She froze, her heart catching. "What do you mean?" "Ich remember it," he said, his voice thin but certain. "Certain. Before I woke up in that hospital 2 years ago, I was somewhere quiet, endless, and there was your voice reading. I didn't understand the words then, but I felt them. I followed them." Her breath trembled. "You're saying my letter brought you back?" He nodded faintly. "And maybe love isn't louder than death. Maybe it just never stopped speaking." Her tears came again, unstoppable this time. "Then I'll never stop either." Julian smiled faintly, his eyelids fluttering. "Promise me something," he said. "When I'm strong enough to leave here, take me to the lighthouse one last time. I want to see it with you." "I promise," she whispered. He exhaled slowly, his eyes closing again. The monitors beside him beeped steadily, their rhythm calm and sure. Ilara leaned closer, pressing a soft kiss to his forehead. Rest, she murmured. You've already come far enough tonight. When he drifted back into sleep, she unfolded the letter once more. There was still one empty space at the bottom, a line she'd never finished. She picked up the pen from the tray beside his bed and wrote the final words, her hand trembling but certain. You found me, Adrian, and I finally found peace. She folded the letter carefully and slipped it into the drawer beside his bed. It didn't need to be sent anymore. It had already done what it was meant to do. Outside, the night deepened, the storm long gone. The sea shimmered beneath the moonlight, and the lighthouse in the distance blinked faintly through the fog, its beam alive again, reaching far into the horizon. Elara watched it from the window, her heart full and trembling, the sound of Julian's quiet breathing grounding her in the present. She closed her eyes, whispering into the stillness. Wherever love goes, I'll follow. And somewhere, faintly, she could have sworn she heard his voice answer, then I'll never be lost again. Days turned to weeks, each one unfolding gently, like the tide retreating from a storm. Julian's strength returned slowly, his steps uncertain but growing surer with each passing day. The hospital room that once smelled of sorrow began to breathe with quiet hope. Elara was always there, reading to him, bringing fresh flowers, sometimes just sitting in silence while he rested. She didn't ask too many questions anymore. The need to understand how he'd come back had faded, replaced by something simpler, gratitude that he had. On the morning he was finally released, the air outside was cool with the scent of rain-soaked dirt. They walked together down the path that led from the hospital to the sea road. Julian wore a light coat, his hair tousled by the wind. He looked fragile still, but alive in a way she hadn't seen before, each breath deliberate, each glance around the world a quiet rediscovery. The sea looks different, he said, gazing at the horizon where sunlight caught on the waves. It hasn't changed, Elara replied softly. You just see it with new eyes. He smiled faintly. And maybe it remembers too much. They reached the cliffs near the lighthouse by afternoon. The air was crisp, the sky washed clean by an earlier drizzle. The lighthouse stood tall and solemn against the endless stretch of blue, its newly restored glass gleaming. When they stepped inside, the air smelled faintly of salt and char, but the walls were clean, the fire damage erased. Julian paused in the centre of the room, his gaze sweeping upward toward the spiral staircase. It feels the same, he murmured, like time didn't touch it. Elara smiled, her voice barely a whisper. A time only forgot for a while. They climbed the steps together, slowly at first, then with quiet certainty. When they reached the lantern room, the view opened around them, a vast stretch of ocean, pale and infinite beneath the early spring sun. The waves rolled in steady rhythm, soft against the rocks below, as though keeping some ancient promise. Julian leaned against the railing, his eyes distant. When I was gone, he said, his voice low, I used to dream of this sound. The sea. It was like a heartbeat. I thought maybe it was yours calling me back. Ilara's hand slipped into his. And maybe it was both of ours, she said. The sea remembers what we forget. He turned to her, studying her face as though searching for something he'd missed. I feel like I'm still two people, he admitted. A Julian, who woke up in the hospital, and Adrian, who loved you before the crash. I don't know how to be both. She squeezed his hand gently. You don't have to choose. You're both because love made you both. It never let either of you go. For a long moment, neither spoke. The sea filled the silence with its patient rhythm. Then Julian reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small, a ring, silver and simple, its surface scratched from years lost to time. Elara froze. It was the same ring she had placed on Adrian's hand before the burial. He held it out to her, his voice trembling. I think it's time this found its way back. Her breath caught. Where did you... He smiled faintly. The doctor said it was found with me. I must have kept it without knowing why. Her eyes filled with tears. You kept it because some part of you remembered. He took her hand and slid the ring gently onto her finger. Maybe now, he whispered, we can both start remembering how to live again. A tear slipped down her cheek as she whispered, you already taught me. Julian looked out toward the horizon, the light catching his eyes in shades of gold and blue. One used to think death was an ending, he said quietly. But now I think it's just another tide, one that takes then returns what it borrowed. Elara leaned her head against his shoulder. And love is the current that brings it back. They stood together as the light turned soft and amber, the sea glittering below. The world felt still again, but not empty. Everything hummed with quiet memory. The waves, the wind, even the stones beneath their feet. It was as if the ocean itself had been holding its breath all this time, waiting for them to return. Julian exhaled slowly, his hand brushing against hers. "We remember something else," he said suddenly. "That the night before the crash, you wrote a note and slipped it into my coat pocket. I never read it." Elara blinked, startled. "I don't remember doing that." He smiled. "You did," it said. "No matter where you go, come home to me." She felt her heart tremble. "But then I guess you did." He turned to her, his expression soft with wonder. "It may be the sea carried it all this time, the note, the memory, and it just washed me back to you." Elara smiled through her tears. "The sea doesn't forget, it just waits." They stayed until dusk, the sky melting into hues of rose and violet. When the first stars appeared, Julian reached for the lever that ignited the lighthouse's great beam. With a soft hum, light bloomed across the sky, strong, golden, eternal. It cut through the twilight, shining far into the sea, as if signalling every lost soul that home was still possible. Elara watched the beam sweep across the horizon, her heart swelling with quiet awe. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Julian nodded. "It's us." The wind swept around them, carrying the scent of salt and fire and something new, renewal. Below, the sea crashed gently against the rocks, steady and endless. Elara closed her eyes, listening to its rhythm. The sea's voice was the same as it had always been. But now she had something new within it, a promise, a memory, a pulse that would never fade. When she opened her eyes again, Julian was still beside her, solid and real, his hand warm around hers. She smiled faintly. "The sea remembers," she said softly. Julian looked at her, his eyes shining with the same light that now filled the sky. "And so do we." A year passed, gentle as the turning of pages in a well-loved book. Seasons came and went, carrying with them the kind of quiet peace Elara had never dared to dream of again. The town by the sea had changed little, though the lighthouse now stood proud and luminous each night, its beam cutting through fog and memory alike. People said it looked reborn, and perhaps it was. After all, some things are not rebuilt by hands alone, but by hearts that have learned to heal. Elara's garden bloomed again that spring. It had once been a place of mourning, a collection of wilting flowers left by trembling hands. Now it was alive with colour, white lilies, blue hydrangeas, wild roses climbing the fence in soft defiance of time. She knelt among them one morning, the air warm with salt and sunlight, her fingers brushing the dew from their petals. Behind her, she heard footsteps crunch softly on the gravel path. Julian's voice, calm and steady, drifted through the breeze. "You've outdone yourself this year." She looked up, smiling as he approached. His face was sun-kissed now, his eyes clear, his gait strong. There was no trace left of the man who had stumbled through the haze of memory and fire. He was both who he had been and who he had become. Whole, finally. "The flowers just needed time," she said. "We all did." He crouched beside her, brushing his fingers against a newly opened bloom. "These are the same ones you used to bring to my grave, aren't they?" Her smile faltered for a moment. "They are. I thought I'd never see them bloom again." He nodded slowly. "And yet here they are." He paused, glancing toward the sea in the distance. "Do you ever think about that day?" "Which one?" she asked softly. "The day I saw you at the grave," he said. "When you dropped the lilies." She let out a quiet breath, her gaze distant. "Every day in some way. But it doesn't haunt me anymore. It feels like a beginning now." He smiled faintly. "It was. I just didn't know it yet." They fell into silence, listening to the waves far below the cliffs. The gulls wheeled above, their cries bright and fleeting. Julian leaned back on his hands, eyes half closed, as though memorizing the scent of the sea. "It feels like another lifetime," he said. "Sometimes I still wonder how any of it happened, how I came back at all." Elara looked at him, her voice tender. "You don't need to understand it. Some things aren't meant to be explained. They're meant to be lived." He turned toward her, a smile tugging gently at the corner of his mouth. "And you're sure this is living?" She laughed softly, the sound warm and real. "This is everything." They rose together and walked toward the cliffs, hand in hand. The lighthouse stood tall ahead of them, its light dim in the daylight but unwavering. Around its base, new wildflowers had begun to bloom, scattering colour across the grass where ash once fell. The scent of them carried on the wind, sweet, alive, forgiving. Julian stopped at the edge of the cliff, gazing at the horizon. "I think the sea's calmer now," he said, as if it's finally let go of something. Maybe it's because you did, Ilara murmured. He looked at her, the corners of his eyes crinkling. You think the sea remembers us? It remembers everything, she said, but it also knows when to rest. They stood there for a while, the quiet between them full of meaning. The world no longer felt divided between life and death, loss and return. It was all one long story, written in tides and wind and the spaces between heartbeats. Julian reached into his pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. I wrote something, he said. And not a letter this time, just a promise. He handed it to her and she unfolded it slowly. The paper was creased from being held too tightly, but the words were clear. For every lifetime we lose, I'll find you in the next. Tears welled in her eyes. You still write like him, she whispered. He smiled gently. And maybe I still am him, or maybe I'm both of us now. Ilara reached up, touching his cheek. Then both of you are loved. A soft breeze lifted her hair, carrying the scent of salt and lilies. She turned her gaze toward the garden below, where the flowers swayed like small, living memories. The sight filled her with quiet certainty that love had not only survived but grown roots deep enough to bloom again. Julian's hand tightened around hers. I used to think dying was the hardest part, he said. But it wasn't. It was coming back and learning how to live again. She looked at him, her eyes bright with emotion. And did you? He nodded slowly. I did, because you waited. They walked down the path together toward the lighthouse, the afternoon light golden around them. Ilara paused to pick one of the lilies, holding it gently in her hand. The petals were soft, perfect. She placed it by the lighthouse steps, the same spot where once she had left flowers for the man she thought she'd lost forever. Julian watched her, understanding in his eyes. A goodbye. A thank you, she whispered. He smiled. Then let's go home. They turned away from the sea, walking back toward the cottage where their lives had begun again. Behind them, the lighthouse gleamed in the sunlight, its beam faint but constant, reaching across water that no longer mourned. In the garden, the flowers swayed with the breeze, their petals glistening under the soft warmth of day. And somewhere between the hush of the waves and the rustle of the blossoms, time itself seemed to pause, as if listening to the story it had helped rewrite. Love, it seemed, had never truly died. It had only changed its name, learned to bloom again where the earth once broke. And somewhere, in the quiet between heartbeats, love began again.